that we began our great stories with the formation of nothing less than the universe. And we talked about the universe to the point that a small blob of rock emerged from a small star. And it spun and cooled, and eventually rain began to fall on this planet. And the rain fell and fell until the planet cooled. And when the planet cooled, minerals began to fill up the oceans. And life emerged from this biome and began to balance the world in a way that the elements all work together to support life. And you remember the timeline of life that took us from those earliest single-celled organisms through multicellular life. Remember the trilobites? Yeah. And eventually, megafauna like dinosaurs roamed the earth. And then, they didn't. A meteor struck, and the world was almost stripped bare. But life survived. And it is into that world that the very first humans emerged. Those humans came from Africa, and they lived lives that were very different from ours, but they had the same type of bodies that we have and the same type of minds. They have a brain that can think, it can imagine and reflect on the past. They have a heart that can love. Those are the unique human gifts. And so human beings lived a very long time. It's true, they had hands that could grasp too, just like us, because they walked upright. Those human beings lived and died for many, many, many generations. Eventually, as they continued to exist, some developed the ability to use tools. They would hit rocks together, just like we saw on the timeline of human beings. And yes, some human beings even figured out how to make and control fire. These humans are the ones who we are going to talk about in our story, because these humans began to travel. Did you know that human beings, in addition to our mind that can think, and our heart that can love, and our hands that can grasp, we have one more superpower that most other animals don't have?
We can see through the back of our head.
We cannot. But what we can do is sweat through our skin. I know, it's gross.
We
and it
have
smells
sweat
bad, but
glands.
It's not good, it's a natural thing.
it is a natural thing, and it's amazing because we can cool ourselves down while we are moving. Have you ever watched a dog that's very excited?
Yeah.
It will run and run and run and run and then stop. And what does it do?
Pants.
It pants. It's panting for a couple reasons. One, because it loves you and you just played with it for half an hour. And two, because it is trying to cool its body down through its mouth
And get air.
and get air. Our bodies can cool down without having to stop. And so human beings can hunt and travel and search for food over incredible distances. And it is this power that brought up a very particular need. You see, human beings can travel over the course of one day much farther than they can yell. 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 And so, yes, I was definitely trying to make an echo. And so, one day, one particular early human, and we do not know what her name was, she went out to find some food for her family. And she traveled and traveled and traveled, and she found that no place close to where she lived had any food. And she went farther and farther on the search for food until she found an incredibly thick berry bush. And she was like, these berries are delicious. Hey, I found berries. Since she was very far away from everyone else, she yelled very loud. No, she yelled in whatever language that she spoke at that time, and we really don't know what it sounds like. But that's a good point. So, she yelled and she listened, and no one yelled back. She was like, what do I do? I need to tell them about this amazing berry bush. I can only carry back some berries. What? How can I leave some sort of message that tells them that these berries are super good to eat? I know! And so she went on the ground, she searched, she found a rock. She went over to a tree by the berry bush, and she began to carve. And she carved a picture. She carved a picture of a mouth, and of berries, and of a smile, or something like that. We don't know exactly what she carved. We just know that human beings, early humans, began to communicate by picture writing. Sometimes human beings would use paint and pigment to write on the walls of their homes.
That's a good drawing.
That is a good drawing. This is an example of an early human painting a picture of what? What is that?
No, a bull.
Yeah, an ox, maybe a bull. This picture,
Red.
why do you think he's making this picture?
To tell people.
To tell people. Dylan, what do you think? Why do you think he's making this picture?
Maybe because there might be some bulls nearby and he wants to let people know so that they don't get hurt.
Possibly for safety.
Because back then they don't have that much food, and maybe you probably saw some bulls or one, and then just drill it so people can get food there.
Or maybe.
Yep. So this is another example of an early human drawing, and what's underneath?
Scratch marks.
There are scratch marks. This was a very early form of counting. This person saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these oxen. That's important for protection because they have horns that could hurt a human. But it's probably important for food as well. And maybe there's a story being told about when the oxen are here and when they're not here because they migrate from place to place. And it could be they come every 10 months. Exactly.
Did they have any bow and arrows to shoot?
The earliest humans that were using tools only had stone knives at first, and they did develop more advanced weaponry and hunting supplies over time. That's something that you could do research on if you wanted to. There's a lot of good information. I actually have over there a little notebook that has some cool timelines of different human tools by the pencil sharpener. But now let's save that for another time. It is really cool research though. All right, so we're going to flash forward a long ways because human beings painted these paintings and carved on stones for hundreds and thousands of years until human beings became so adept, so good at these paintings that they wanted to communicate more efficiently. There was a place called Mesopotamia, which means the land between two rivers, and they would draw symbols like this onto clay tablets. You can see these are still clearly pictures. Here is a reed, and what do you think this is?
Necklace. Oxen.
An ox, maybe it's a necklace. And what do you think this is?
A boat.
A fish or a boat. And what about this?
A
Melted Hershey Kiss.
A melted Hershey. Very
A
creative.
goose.
I don't think
Oh,
they
I
had
see
Hershey
that.
Kisses back then. To me, it looks like a swan
Yeah.
or maybe a goose. But you see how these are much simpler than these paintings, and you could probably write them down much more quickly. You see, these would be painted on a cave wall. These could be carved into a small, wet tablet of clay. You know, ancient Sumerians had tablets too.
They did?
They
What kind of
did. They
tablets?
didn't glow. They were small pieces of clay, and they would use a stylus, which at the time was like a piece of bamboo carved to a point, and they would carve their letters or their pictures into the tablet.
But like, they can't go. Tablets meaning like the tablets we have written now.
They were in the same shape as the tablets we have right now, and the tablets they made are what our tablets are named after.
Apple?
So there's another society.
Hieroglyphics.
Yes, hieroglyphics. Who makes the hieroglyphics, Silas?
Egyptians.
Yeah, the ancient Egyptians made hieroglyphics. They would carve their picture writing onto walls. You can see here, there are many different pictures.
And each picture makes a word or a letter.
That's right. So some of these, like this snake, could mean an actual snake.
Like
This ibis could be an ibis, but
it could also be Thoth.
it could also be Thoth, who's one of the deities of ancient Egypt. It could also be flight. So these pictures could represent the physical thing, or they could represent an idea that the thing does, or they could represent something completely abstract, like a deity. So these are some examples of different Egyptian hieroglyphs. And, so you know, the Egyptians, well, they did start carving their words into stone and then painting over that stone. They also developed something very important to us today.
Papyrus?
Yes, they developed papyrus. Can you pass me that
Paper.
scroll right there, please, Melanie? Yeah. This paper is very special.
Right on that. Because
One could write on this or paint on it with ink and a brush. This is the type of paper that the ancient Egyptians developed, and they actually developed a language that is not picture writing, called demotic, that you could write on paper with. So, the ancient Egyptians were very influential, and they had many resources. They had food, they had paper, and so they were a part of a trade network. Now remember that the mouth of the Nile opens onto the Mediterranean Sea, and so there was a group of people who would trade with them. Those people were called the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians had a home base in what today is called Lebanon, over here on the coast of the Mediterranean as well,
next to Turkey.
next to Turkey. So, the Phoenicians traded all around the Mediterranean, and they had something very special that everyone wanted, that they would trade gold for. Do you remember?
Yes.
What was it?
The crushed shells of a thing that came from sea that made purple dye.
That's right. They had a special process for crushing the shells of small arthropods, and it created what color?
Purple.
It created a vibrant purple
Oh, I
color,
remember that.
and they would dye cloth in this purple color, and people loved it so much that they would trade gold and silver for this cloth. And the Phoenicians became extravagantly wealthy, and the color purple forever after the Phoenicians was associated with royalty. Yes,
Can
Harmony,
I use the bathroom?
of course. Dylan.
Was that when did the ancient Chinese come up with their form of writing?
The Chinese came up with their form of writing before the Phoenicians, but what I want to tell you about the Phoenicians is that they did something very special. The Phoenicians developed an alphabet based on the Egyptian picture writing. But these letters did not represent an idea. They didn't have a picture of what they were trying to say. Each one of these symbols represented one sound. So you could use these phonemes to make any sounding word in any language. Now the Phoenicians, they traded with the Egyptians. They also traded with the Greeks. And so these letters, they are now letters in an alphabet, got acquired and modified by the ancient Greeks. This looks familiar, doesn't it? This is the Greek alphabet, but we can see some similarities. Look at alpha. This is alpha. Look at the Phoenician alpha. What if I turn it this way? Does that look similar?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks like the apple.
Delta, delta. There are many similarities. Eta. So many. Eta, thank you. You can tell that these languages are related. Now the Greeks, we'll talk a lot about the Greeks this year. I know, you're so excited. Their language was incredibly influential, especially as time went on another important society, the Romans. And the Romans created this alphabet.
What's that alphabet? I don't know what that is.
I know. This is the Roman alphabet. And you could be mistaken into thinking it's the English alphabet, but there are some differences.
There's no J or U.
Or
The I-K-L-N is or U.
There's
or
no
U.
J.
Yeah,
there's
W.
no J,
Oh,
there's
there's
no
no
U.
W.
What?
There's no W.
There's no W.
There's no U.
And there's no U. So this is different than our alphabet. You also may notice something. What do we write with that is not on here at all?
Lowercase.
Lowercase.
There's no lowercase.
And spaces.
So, exactly. It's like you've been in this lesson before.
We have.
The Romans, when they wrote, they would write all in uppercase, and they would not put spaces in, and they had very few vowels. So their writing was just really difficult to read unless you were very well trained. And only very well trained people could read. It was not as many people who can read today. And so that evolved over time into the letters that we use. You can see now we have uppercase and lowercase so that we can better differentiate our words. We have more vowels.
That also looks odd. I've never seen that.
What? Okay, we have a lot of work to do. No, I'm kidding. This is our language, and this has been the story of the development of our language. There are more details that we can give about the development of our spoken language, but this is very particularly where our letters came from. We'll explore this more in the future, but now you know the story. Does anyone have any questions? Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Luna.
So this isn't really about the alphabet, but how did humans figure out they needed water?
Everything needs water, like every creature does. So we'd have to go all the way back to the very first creatures that crawled out of the sea, and they needed water to breathe and to lay their eggs in, and so much so. So it's always been a part of us who do not live in the ocean that we need to drink water. Yeah, Sophie, and then Dylan.
Did the Romans make the alphabet we have today, or did other people?
So our letters mostly come from the Romans. The letters the Romans didn't have came from other sources, like, well, of course we did develop lowercase, but some of the vowels that we have now came from the development of our language from Old English, which was a different language than Latin, but was related to Latin. So those were developed in the time between Latin and modern English. And we can talk more about that when we talk about our development of our spoken language in a later lesson. Dylan.
Was ancient Chinese an influencer to any language used and or influenced by any other languages?
So ancient Chinese is incredibly influential in East Asia. Their picture writing, they still use picture writing. They do not have an alphabet in China today. But Chinese picture writing became incredibly complex and abstract quickly. And it was so influential that in Japan, they did not have their own written language for hundreds of years. They just used the Chinese language. And then when they discovered there were some things they wanted to say in their own language that were hard to write in Chinese, they developed their own alphabet. But literally hundreds of years of just using the Chinese alphabet. The same thing happened in Korea and in Southeast Asia. So, the Chinese language is kind of like the Phoenicians for Europe. It is for East Asia. But of course, it's not an alphabet like ours. It's still picture language. And so, whereas we only have to remember 20-some symbols, in China, there are literally thousands of different symbols you have to memorize.
But we also have to learn different words, which are multiple symbols.
Oh, certainly. And it poses different benefits. It is a bit more efficient to be able to write any word with a very small number of symbols as opposed to memorizing additional symbols. And I say that only as a person who has attempted to memorize a lot of Chinese symbols. It's challenging.
Do you remember them?
I've attempted.
Oh yeah, I know a bunch because I spent time in Japan, and in Japan they still do use the Chinese symbols in addition to their own alphabet. Saki.
In Burma, if I recall correctly, there are 240 something or 47
I
letters?
believe there's more than that.
Really? Of letters? For
No,
the alphabet?
The Chinese don't use letters, they use just picture writing. So they don't have an alphabet like we do. Dylan, and then I'm going to let you guys go.
Does any part of ancient Egypt still use hieroglyphics?
So the language of ancient Egypt stopped being used. And they didn't just have one. So they had hieroglyphics, and I mentioned they had Demotic. They had a whole other language as well. But so much it wasn't used that we lost the ability to read it until we found something very important.
The stone.
Yes, the stone. Do you remember the name of the stone? Does anyone know this very
Rosetta.
important stone? What?
The Rosetta Stone?
The Rosetta Stone, exactly. It was found. And the important thing about the Rosetta Stone was they had 3 copies of one speech. The first copy was in hieroglyphics. The second copy was in hieratic, which is another language that we had completely lost. But the third one was in classical Greek. And we could read classical Greek. So from the classical Greek, we learned how to translate hieratic and hieroglyphics, which is just super cool. And then we were able to go back and read all of ancient Egypt.
The Rosetta Stone was actually a thank you letter to Alexander the Great.
I believe it was a speech by Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy, who then became the
Pharaoh.
Thank you. That's the word. The Pharaoh of Egypt. And his great granddaughter was
Cleopatra.
Cleopatra.
Ptolemy.
Also, fun fact: Cleopatra lived closer to now than she lived towards the building of the Great Pyramids. So when you talk about how old the Great Pyramids are and how old Egypt is, It is that old. Thank you all very much. You can return to your work.